My name's Kerry Howard and I'm the Chief Exec of the GSA. We are the industry association and professional body for all things strategic sourcing. And we look after the interests of the community, the best practice, the thought leadership of bringing buyers and service providers together to do more partnering and to do that partnering better. And that's partnering of technology and business services. So without further ado, let me introduce my fellow speakers today, and I'll introduce them in the order of when they'll be speaking. So delighted to have Marcia Beliciano from RELX with us. Marcia is founding head of ESG and responsible business. Marcia.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and that was a great introduction.
Excellent, thank you. And next up will be Graham Trevane, who is Associate Director with Koyus. Graham, welcome.
Yeah, good morning. Yes, thank you. Pleased to be here. Very much appreciate the invitation to come and present what we're doing with our clients. So it's hopefully a good discussion.
Excellent, thank you. And then we'll also be hearing from Anne Todd, who's a Senior Associate with McFarlane's. So, Anne. Welcome.
Thanks, Kerry. Hi, everybody. Yes, I'm a senior solicitor at McFarlane's, advising on both the customer and also the supplier side. I work predominantly in technology, but also general business services, and I was general counsel advising in-house for about 20 years. Thanks.
Excellent. So I think we've got a really fantastic lineup of practitioners, experts in ESG, as well as those advising on aspects affecting it. So just to kick off, obviously ESG, if you don't have ESG on your radar, you've obviously been living under a rock. I mean, it's probably the biggest hot topic right now in the industry, and we're absolutely delighted to have somebody with us who is incredibly experienced with ESG. We did speak to quite a lot of our members to see if they were in a position to share their journeys. And there are very, very few companies that feel confident enough to talk about where they're at and how they've actually progressed with ESG. So really delighted to have Marcia with us, who has set up, I guess, the ESG program very successfully. So RELX has been AAA rated now for the last 6 years, so a very mature ESG program. So I'd be really delighted to hear from you, Marcia, your journey, your challenges, your hints and tips and words of advice that you can help with the community. So over to you, Marcia.
Thank you very much. And Kerry, I really like that word that you used, which is a journey, because we don't have all the answers. We are, each year striving to be better and better. So RELX is a global provider of information-based data analytics and digital decision tools, and we are committed to universal sustainable access to information. So we are listed in London, New York, and Amsterdam, and we operate in 4 market segments: in risk, which goes under the name of LexisNexis Risk Solutions; in science, technical, and medical, which is Elsevier; legal, which is LexisNexis Legal and Professional, and my legal colleagues on the panel will have heard of that company before; and exhibitions, RX, which is very large events business. And one of the things that I've seen, I've been with the company over 15 years, is our transformation from what you could say was a traditional print-based publisher to a company that is all about data, and data that makes a difference. So I have, as Kerry was saying, the privilege of having been the founding head of ESG. But of course, when I started, it wasn't called ESG. And I'm very interested in terminology because it changes a lot. To me, it doesn't really matter whether you call it sustainability, corporate responsibility, ESG, although sustainability traditionally had a connotation around the environment, and ESG has had a very strong association with our investors. But at the end of the day, this is not a set of programs that is parked in some part of the business that's not connected up to the rest. This is really about how we do what we do every day. And that needs to be the mission, even if they don't know those terms, of the 33,000 people around the world in 40 countries that we employ, of which around 9,000 of them are technologists. So one thing that we really began to focus on from the beginning is, what is our contribution to society? Again, and when we think about terminology, sometimes companies think about phrasing that as their purpose. Again, whatever words that you want to use, we need to think about, where do we make a contribution to society, because that's the license to operate. So in those businesses that I described, for risk solutions, it's about providing essential data and analytics to protect people. So we have tools that fight fraud, for example, cybercrime, and it's also about providing critical industry insights. So over the weekend, I was seeing a story in the press using some data that we have from Cirium, which is for the global aviation industry. Elsevier is about progressing human welfare and economic progress through science and health, tools and analytics. LexisNexis Legal is about promoting the rule of law and access to justice. And RX, the events business, is about fostering communities through those events, which enhance productivity and improve the efficiency of markets. And then PanRelex, it's about universal sustainable access to information. So this is the thinking that we did. And we thought, okay, if we have identified these things, then one of the next steps is about setting objectives in these areas. We have public objectives with our unique contributions that you can find online at relex.com in the corporate responsibility report. And then we also set objectives to the material issues that affect all companies: governance, people, customers, community, environment, and of course, near and dear to all of our hearts, supply chain. I'm going to talk a little bit more about supply chain, but let me just say that we link those objectives for our unique contributions, and then for the material issues, to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I don't know if you can see my pin, I'm leaning forward. That's the SDG wheel, 17 goals for the world. That was adopted by all the nations of the UN in 2015, running through 2030 to try and make the world a better place and address some of the most critical challenges of our time, including climate change. To give you an example on supply chain, one of those material issues that we all have to address, we've linked that up with SDG 8, which is decent work and economic growth. And the focus is on, for this year, increasing the number of suppliers as code signatories to our RELEX Supplier Code of Conduct, continuing to use audits to ensure continuous improvement in supplier performance and compliance, and then also supplier diversity, which we think links with SDG 10, reduced inequalities. Our goal for this year is to advance our supplier diversity and inclusion program. And I think one of the things about the SDGs, there's stuff that each company is doing that aligns, and it's about scaling that. So it's not just business as usual, it's about figuring out, for the good stuff that you do and your contribution to society, how you can scale that. So let me just talk a little bit about the steps that we're taking on supply chain. You can find the details of this in our corporate responsibility report, but there's also another important place that many of us have to be concerned with that are listed in the United Kingdom, and that's our Modern Slavery Act statement. So we have to show, and that's available from our homepage, how we're avoiding human trafficking and modern slavery in our direct operations, but then also in our supply chain. So we talk about that in terms of how we go about trying to ensure that it is an ethical supply chain, and that's a challenge. Some of you may have bigger supply chains than we do, but they're in over 150 countries across multiple categories, and those categories include things like technology, hardware, software, cloud, telecom, etc., indirect, consulting, marketing, contingent labor, travel, direct, which is content and production services for us, print, paper, and binding distribution. Even though, as I told you at the beginning of my remarks, the transition that we've made is really to become, a bona fide technology business, and the share of print-based product has reduced over the last 20 years, where online digital accounted last year for about 80% of our turnover. We still print a lot. That's still important that we address that in our supply chain. So given the importance of having an ethical supply chain, we have a socially responsible supplier program, which is encompassing the whole of the business. It's supported by colleagues in expertise in operations and procurement, and we have a dedicated socially responsible supplier director who houses in global procurement. So we have, as I mentioned, a very comprehensive supplier code of conduct. It's available in 16 languages, which we ask suppliers to sign and display prominently in their workplaces. And it commits them to following applicable laws and best practice areas in things like human rights, labor, and environment. And I want to give a big shout out and really encourage you, if you are not already a member of the United Nations Global Compact, please consider doing that. I don't feel I'm biased, even though I'm chair of the network here in the United Kingdom, but this has been so helpful to us. We've been a signatory since 2003, and there are 10 principles related to human rights, labor, environment, anti-corruption, and our own RELEX Code of Ethics and our supplier code are anchored in those 10 principles. And there's so much support to help us look at having an ethical supply chain. So at the end of 2020, to give you a sense, about 91% of our suppliers on our tracking list, and we have certain criteria for which suppliers make it onto the tracking list, including our suppliers in high-risk locations. And we work with the non-signatories to gain their agreement to the code. That's very important that they come along and sign up, or if they can convince us that they have equivalent standards, that will help us to work with them. And we engage a specialist supply chain auditor. In our case, that's Intertek. And last year they undertook, even during the pandemic, 99 external audits. However, only 25 of them were 74 were desktop audits, 25 were virtual on-site audits. So during the desktop audits, the supplier responds to an online questionnaire, uploads relevant supporting documentation, followed by a third-party audit. And for the virtual on-site audits, this was an absolute necessity given the challenges of COVID. The facility representative wore a video and audio source located in a lightweight harness to allow remote interaction with a qualified auditor. The auditor could then evaluate the facility, conduct the interviews, and then review the necessary documentation in real time, just as if they were undertaking an in-person audit. Any incidence of non-compliance triggers a continuous improvement report, which summarizes the audit results and remediation plans, and we work with the suppliers to agree that, and also we have a time frame so that we have less than a month for anything that's a zero tolerance issue, and then up for minor issues where they have a little bit more time to remediate. Always, we're working to bring our suppliers along with us. We don't want to terminate if we can avoid that. But at the end of the day, the supplier code has to have teeth. And if we've done our best and we've really worked with the supplier to remediate and they just can't come with us, then we need to terminate, and we will do that, and we have done that. So I also just wanted to say that in some of the ways that we're working with our suppliers at the moment is around improving Scope 3. So in terms of our environmental performance, like you, we need to be concerned with our direct emissions, our Scope 1 and our Scope 2, but actually we know that Scope 3, as an office-based business, primarily for RELEX, Scope 3, what happens in our supply chain dwarfs what we emit directly ourselves. So we've been doing a piece of work to engage with our suppliers. And something I'm really excited about is that in the next couple of weeks, we have our first supplier sessions where we are using a great technology called Hopin to bring outside speakers and to talk about some of the issues that are important to us, including around living wage, making sure that we have living wage in our direct operations, but also in our supply chain, bringing in colleagues, for example, from the Global Compact to talk about how they can support suppliers in their work. We also, in our reporting, have good partners where we focus, that's a section of our supply chain area of our corporate responsibility report, where we let one of our suppliers talk about how they're approaching ESG issues in their own work. And then there's two quick examples, and I am going to wind up in a minute here. Two quick examples of industry collaboration. If I had to say what my biggest tip is, it's don't do this alone. You have a great organization in the GSA, and wherever you can work on non-price sensitive collaboration, you can really move things forward, because maybe your suppliers are bigger than you, and they, if you're just one voice, they may not pay as close attention. When you are a sector, they tend to be listening a little bit harder. So one of the ways that we've done this is through Principles for Responsible Environmental Paper Sourcing, or PREPS. This has been going now for well over 5 years, and it helps us to engage with our paper suppliers off the back of PREPS, where we are trying to ensure that the paper that we buy is from known and legal sources. Working with the suppliers to get their paper data into a database, we built a paper policy so that we only buy paper that is graded 3 stars and above, which is that known and legal sources. Another good example is called the Digital Impact of Media, DIMPACS, and this is another industry collaboration, both of these that we do through a great organization that we belong to and are founding members of, called the Responsible Media Forum. And what we are aiming to do is create a methodology for our cloud computing. So those of us in the media sector, we want to work with our cloud-based suppliers to get a better sense of our share of their emissions, and also a way of having a robust methodology. We're doing it together as sector peers, and also working with Bristol University. So finally, I mentioned about the Sustainable Development Goals. I wanted to show this as an example of PanRelic's universal sustainable access to information. And I'm going to put in the chat when I'm done a link so that you can find it. We have content across our 4 businesses in every one of the SDGs. And when I looked last night in preparation for these remarks today, I found 273 results in the RELX SDG Resource Center. This is a free portal for the world. We've had over 100,000 unique users this year, but we want lots and lots more. This is content that you would not necessarily be able to find as easily as you can on the Resource Center, and some of it would be behind a paywall that you wouldn't have access to unless you were already an existing customer. We've curated this content. There's 110 different resources, 161 research articles. So there's book chapters, there's events, there's features, there's reports, special issues, etc. So I hope that you will check that out, and I hope it could be helpful to you. So thank you so much for this opportunity to tell you a little bit about this journey, and I look forward to discussing more in the Q&A.
Thank you so much for that, Marcia. That has triggered a million questions for me. I'm sure it's triggered loads of questions for people in the audience. So if you have got any questions, do please put them in the chat. And I'm going to come back and ask some of those questions of you in a moment, Marcia. But thank you very much. And there's so much information that is being shared, which is absolutely phenomenal. So I'm sure everybody is now jumping straight into your website and looking at all the different links that you know and forums that you discussed. So thank you for that. So yes, questions are beginning to come on in. Thank you. But we will come to those at the end. So over to you now, Graham. I think, Abby, if you can share some slides.
Okay, so good morning. Thank you very much. By way of a small introduction for myself, I'm actually the Associate Director for the EU office of Koyus. We'll get into Koyus a little bit more in the next couple of slides. My history with ESG is that I've personally been involved in the environmental ethical space for about 15-20 years at a personal level. So, for example, I ran the country campaign for Meat Free Mondays in Belgium for a number of years, looking at global warming. We actually presented at COP21 as part of an overall climate change campaign all the way back. That was probably 2014-15 when the COP21 was. It's so long ago I've forgotten now. But so it's been an issue that's been quite close to my heart. But today I'm going to try and keep it on the IT side. So who is Koyus? If we could move to the next slide. Okay, so Koyus is a relatively small but independent IT and business advisory company. We have a number of key services that we focus on with our customers, which you can see on the left here, which is to do with the strategy, the sourcing, change and architecture. What we're seeing is that there are basically three main areas that the customers are asking us to help with their ESG topics. The first one is, how do you digitalize in order to make your business more efficient? And Marcia raised quite a few of those questions about, how do you eliminate paper-based processes? How do you make processes more efficient? How do you engage with your customers on their customer journey? How do you do with your e-commerce versus traditional commerce chains? So a lot of digitalization has been taking place and has been accelerated over the last couple of years to do with obviously the way that people are engaging both on work and commerce as we get more remote. The second one is, how do you actually then make sure that IT is effective in not outweighing the benefits that you're seeing elsewhere? So it's no good streamlining a process if the IT you put in actually creates more in the way of environmental issues for your business. So we need to make sure there's a balance there. And then the other one is on particularly important to Koyus is strategic sourcing. About 40% of our business is actually in the sourcing world, primarily IT sourcing. But what we're seeing is that the credentials, and again, as Marcia raised in her speech, introduction, was that the credentials of the suppliers that you're engaging is very, very important. So again, trying to keep within the IT space. If you're moving more towards, sort of battery-based technology for storage and generation of storage of energy, how do you make sure that the lithium and the cobalt that was in those batteries is properly sourced and things like that? So it goes well beyond IT, but we see that the IT organizations can take a lead in developing those processes and focus within the company. So from Koyus in itself, we've been around since 2013. We're growing, 50 plus employees. I think we're up to 53 over the last couple of weeks as we've had a few new starters. We're split pretty much 50-50 between the UK and Germany. A lot of our customers in Germany are large manufacturing companies who have obviously a great deal of environmental concerns about the impact on the environment of their manufacturing activities. But equally, we deal with a lot of e-commerce people who are very, very keen to make sure that their supply chains are fully compliant with their ethical policies. So again, as the data aspect of that is very, very important to them. We actually span a lot of the industries. We do a lot of energy. We've been doing quite a lot of new energy work with some of the larger old carbon-based companies, helping them transition to the new economy. But also, as I say, financial services, public services, they all have requirements that we're seeing becoming more and more important as part of their overall IT strategies. So if we go to the next slide, please, Abby. Okay, so what are the challenges for the IT? I'll try and stay on IT topic today as part of where we are within Koyus. But what we're looking at is the net zero and EU manifestos for climate change is one very big area, because we know that data centers consume about 2% of the world's electricity today. That's not a huge amount when you compare it with things like the meat industry, which is 15%, transport, which is 15%, and in areas such as the UK, for example, transport is up to 28% of the emissions coming out, being generated. So what are the challenges? Well, what we're seeing is that one of the biggest areas we're working with customers is getting them to understand that it's more than just a carbon footprint question. What are you looking at? The supply chain, single-use plastics, deforestation, water consumption, they all have an impact within the IT world. And in order to comprehend the impacts that those topics are having, the businesses need to digitalize but be agile in order to be able to change supply chains, change suppliers, and change their business model to reduce the impact of those factors within their overall business pattern. What we're also seeing, as I say, we're working with quite a few of the energy companies, is how do they actually change their upstream, downstream management systems. We're talking about EV charging demand. That's going to change the pattern of consumption. We're doing some work with quite a few of the, particularly in the German space, where hydrogen is a very important part of the renewables and the planning from the government. So how do you actually change your transportation network of your gas to be able to do a blend of hydrogen and gas? There's some legal issues to do with legislation about how much hydrogen you can transport within the pipes. But within that, then, of course, you've got the control issues and the management issues of predicting the supply and demand of the hydrogen within that, making sure it gets to the right place at the right time. And what we're seeing from a lot of customers also is that, our customers, is that their customers are driving environmental considerations. If you're not producing a report that covers the entire scope of your business, including IT, in your sustainability report, then people start asking questions about how complete is that report. So we work with quite a few of our clients looking at their sustainability reports and seeing how IT can actually provide a large, a decent contribution to that report. So next slide again, please, Abby. So, as I say, we're working with the customers to understand their issues. So there are two that we work with. As I say, it's carbon neutral. Koyus itself has been carbon neutral for 4 or 5 years, and in fact, we're carbon negative at the moment. But what we're now doing is moving, if you like, to the next stage of saying, OK, let's look at net zero. So as well as just offsetting our carbon, and obviously reduction in travel for us has been a huge benefit. We're making sure that our customers are working with us to continue that trend. But we don't want to offset the carbon. What we want to do is look at the other issues. So eliminate, reduce and offset where you can't eliminate or reduce. So looking at things like single-use plastics, looking at things like the office footprint as well. So we are buying renewable energy in our offices. We don't have as much in the way of direct costs for things like heating and petrol for fleets of cars and things like that. So where do we go then? We have a look at the indirect areas, such as the supply chain and other things that you might not have direct control over. But as I say, as Marcia said, that you have an influence over the supply chains and the ethical practices there. So looking at things like that. The other area that we tend to deal with our customers quite substantially is looking at territorial versus consumption emissions. It's very easy to export your emissions or your issues elsewhere, but you need to take responsibility for that overall picture. I think there was a debate recently in the UK where one of the MPs, I think it was John Redwood, said, the UK is half German emissions, so we're not going to do anything until Germany does something. But then you look at exactly how that works. And yes, there's a population difference. We're looking at the manufacturing base, which is about twice in Germany what it is in the UK. And then you look at things like car manufacturers. There are about 1 million cars being imported into the UK from Germany, and each one of those comes with anywhere between 6 or 35 tons of CO2. So you've got a consumption-based carbon impact as well as a territorial base. looking at other areas and say that top 5 British supermarkets, I think that was on the BBC recently, looking at just putting fridge doors on refrigerated cabinets cuts electricity by 1%. Little things that can make a big difference if a lot of people do them. There's 7 billion people in the world. If everybody cuts their usage by 1%, then that's 7 billion times 1% reduction, which is a huge impact on the overall planet's supply and demand. And again, plastic packaging is one that's very important to a lot of our customers. Only about currently 15% of plastic packaging is recycled. We see a lot of waste. We've seen a lot of reports about masks polluting the environment now since the pandemic. A lot of plastic in those, and let's say 40% ends up in landfill, but a lot of others gets incinerated, which not only has CO2 impact but also toxic pollution in various areas. So we're trying to work with our customers to understand where they can actually make a difference in both CO2 and also environmental concerns. So that's all I really wanted to start with. It's sort of really just to try and open up the topics, and we'll deal with the questions as we go into the forum. So thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Graham. So in the interest of time, we're going to move straight on. So Anne, over to you, and then we'll thank you for putting the questions in. We will be coming to those.
Thanks, everybody. Abby, are you able to share my slides for me? Whilst we're doing that, just a little bit of background about me. I'm a senior solicitor at Macfarlane's. We're a law firm in the City of London. We have an ESG team advising all of our clients on all the different legal and regulatory aspects of ESG, but my particular focus is in the contracting, in the contractual chain, acting on behalf of both customers and also suppliers who are grappling with the challenges that we're all facing. A little bit of background as well. I also sit on the Legal and Policy Committee of an organisation called Open UK, which is looking at all of the aspects of open source software, open data, open technology. And one of our really large areas of concern is in relation to the consumption of electricity in data centres and what the industry can be doing to work towards more open use of technology and standards in that area. But I thought I'd focus today on the contractual perspective and the things that I see on a day-to-day basis when I'm advising clients. So if you can turn to the first page, please, Abby. As Marcia said at the beginning, we're all on a journey here, and some organisations are much further along the journey than other organisations. And there is unfortunately not a great amount of contractual precedence when it comes to dealing with ESG. We've all worked through the challenges of the Bribery Act and the Modern Slavery Act, and there are plenty of very good contractual precedents for those types of obligations. But when it comes to environmental and sustainability issues and the wider issues relating to ESG, that really is a fairly open book at the moment. And there's also a lack of information generally in the market about what is contractual best practice. So when it comes to advising clients who are trying to incorporate clauses into their contracts, or when it comes to suppliers who are reviewing obligations in contracts, it's often quite challenging to define some very practical and measurable targets. And it's also difficult to discuss and also propose some really meaningful contractual remedies. The traditional remedies of termination and liquidated damages and financial damages are not always fully relevant in this context. And as Marcia explained, that termination is really normally the last resort. And so there's a need to really start thinking about what the really practical contractual remedies should be. And then also we have all of the challenges of cascading the different contractual obligations throughout the supply chain. And when you are a supplier sitting in the middle, or indeed at the very bottom of a supply chain, dealing with numerous different requirements from numerous different customers, it can be very challenging and ultimately also extremely costly. And I think there is a general concern that just passing those costs through the supply chain isn't necessarily what we're trying to achieve. There's also a question over transitional arrangements, and just moving straight into a new contract with new obligations at renewal isn't always going to work very well. And customers need to actually start discussing the changes to their contractual expectations at a much earlier stage than the actual time for renewal. And I think it's fair to say, as we've heard earlier, there's certainly not one size fits all. So those are the challenges that I see in practice. But if we turn to the next page, there actually are some there is an organisation which certainly on the environmental and sustainability side is doing a great deal to help customers, suppliers, and also lawyers like myself. And this is the Chancery Lane project, and Macfarlane's is a member of this, along with a lot of other law firms. And it is a collaborative effort from lawyers all around the world. And our vision is to create a world where every contract enables solutions to climate change and sustainability. And there are 270 organisations involved. And as you can see, well over 1,000 legal professionals from in-house and private practice, public sector, universities, and also LexisNexis are kindly involved as well. It's politically neutral, and the aim is to create some really practical toolkits and very practical contractual clauses that can be used and adapted by organisations in their standard agreements, so that people are not left trying to come up with entirely new clauses. It has an open membership, it's free to join, and all of the material is available on the website, which I've listed there in the slide, and the material is free to copy and use. And any lawyers out there who wish to join would be very welcome to join and contribute their own clauses. So if you can move on to the next page. So there was just, for example, as well, there are a lot of there's just to give some examples of the types of information in the toolkit. We have a checklist that will help organisations when they're starting to consider the types of contractual obligations they may need to or may wish to include. It just gives some food for thought for organisations at the early stage. There's also a glossary and some standard definitions, because I think it is very important that we all have the same understanding of the terms, and there's consistency. So there's a whole very useful glossary of definitions. I've just set out a few there just to give you an idea of the types of definitions. And if you can move on to the next page. There's also a fairly, well, it's a growing clause bank. It's already fairly extensive, but it's growing all the time. And these are specific clauses which have been drafted by leading law firms and in-house lawyers. And the clauses are all peer reviewed to make sure that they are fit for purpose. And clauses are continually being added. And there's a range of general clauses that can be included in all kinds of different contracts. I know we're focusing on the IP and tech sectors here today, but these clauses apply to pretty much all sectors and in different contracting scenarios, whether it's funding, corporate acquisitions, as well as contracting with the supply chain. And they start right at the early days of non-disclosure agreements and questions as standard clauses that might go in ITTs. There are due diligence questionnaires, self-assessment questionnaires, and contract risk sharing clause, which is, I think, actually quite useful. For example, if a climate impact affects the supplier, how that risk might actually be shared between the supplier and the customer. And there are also cascade clauses designed to pass the obligations down through the supply chain, and an emissions scorecard as well. I mean, these are just a few. There's well over 100 standard clauses, and the clauses are also categorized into different sectors. So, for example, IP, IT, and buildings and land, to name just a couple of the different sectors. If you can move on to the next slide. So just very quickly, there is also a case study from Salesforce, who have used one of the clauses in the clause bank to create a binding sustainability exhibit that they have now passed on to their own supply chain. As you can see, they're hoping that suppliers representing 60% of their Scope 3 emissions will set science-based targets. And the exhibit went live, I think, in April of this year. And the suppliers are asked to sign up to some commitments, some legally binding commitments to set their own science-based targets, and also share data and transparency, both with Salesforce and also more generally make that public. And there are some contractual remedies for non-compliance. At the most severe end, Salesforce reserves the right to terminate its supply contract, or in less severe circumstances, then it expects the supplier to pay a remediation fee, which, as you can see, is 0.5% of the previous 12 months charges. And that payment is made to an appointed beneficiary, which is a charitable beneficiary involved in the environment and sustainability. So that's all I really wanted to say. I know that contractual clauses are quite dull, so I'll pass back to Kerry for the panel discussion.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much, Anne. Okay, so there's been quite a lot of conversation of maybe terminating if suppliers in the supply chain can't improve. And there's also been a bit of conversation about supplier diversity. Now, previous conversations I've had with some of our members is that it's really, really difficult for some of the smaller companies to invest in what's actually needed to make themselves so much greener. So, you know, one example I was given by an insurance company is they're speaking to all their garages for the repair works. And so repair works to cars, to actually buy the clean oven baking system, it would cost them over £300,000, which for a small family-owned garage would be 5 years worth of profits. So how do you, I'm going to go to you for this one first, Marcia, but how do you actually handle that with smaller companies where it's, you know, it's just going to be so difficult for them to clean up the way that they probably want to, but because they can't afford to do it?
Well, some of that work that I mentioned that we're doing around Scope 3, I think will be helpful so that we can share some of the tools that we've developed and some of the things that we are engaging in on our journey to be net zero. So in 2020, we achieve net zero on our Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Scope 3 is going to take a lot longer. And I think that example that we just heard from Anne of Salesforce is really picking things up a bit. You know, that is really impressive. And we need those examples because that helps for someone like me to take that back into our organization and say, see. Now we have a science-based. We have right from the beginning engaged with the Science-Based Target Initiative. It's a thing, the SBTI, and we use their methodology to set a science-based carbon reduction target. But if you want to get your target kind of signed off and credited by the SBTI, you have to have a reduction aspiration that is articulated to the outside world for your supply chain. And the idea there is with all of these initiatives to help kind of raise the level of ambition for all of us. And something that we've done this year, a few things that will hopefully help us. We've signed up to something called the Climate Pledge. This is asking us to achieve net zero across all our scopes by 2040 at the latest. Last year, we signed up, I mentioned about the Responsible Media Forum. We together as the forum members launched the Climate Pact. That said, we must set science-based carbon reduction targets. We will undertake training in our organization around net zero and climate. And we will also use our content. That goes back to those unique contributions that I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, that we do what it is that we're uniquely qualified to do. And for so many of us, it's making sure that these messages are getting across in what we do every day. And for us, that's around our content and tools.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you. Right, so not trying to be negative here, but it does feel like there's a lot of reinvention of wheels. So, you know, you're doing, well, what I'm hearing from a lot of our members is every enterprise buyer is asking their service providers to fill in, you know, lengthy due diligence questionnaires. They're doing their own versions of these due diligence questionnaires, and then every service provider is having to fill in a multitude of these due diligence questionnaires for each and every one of their customers. Are we getting closer to some sort of recognised sort of standard that organisations can just take the due diligence questionnaire, or they can actually access the information of how good a service provider's ESG rating is? So I don't know if you want to answer that one.
If I could step in there, I mean, it's certainly in the IT space. It's a new set of questions for a lot of the people we're dealing with. When we run a procurement process, strategic sourcing, RFP, we always put in now ESG questions to the suppliers, and to a great extent, the responses coming back are anywhere from fair to poor and non-existent. Because a lot of the people in that space aren't really considering it. So what we're trying to do is make sure that the message gets across the whole organization. Salesforce has been mentioned here, which is good because they actually have a net zero energy policy now. So everything that they're using is renewable, and they're trying to eliminate everything that's not. Google is net zero for life now as part of their campaign. And there are a few good tools coming in with some of those cloud providers that allow you to measure the carbon footprint of the cloud resources you're using from them. So the message is getting out there, but getting the certainly in the IT space, the recognition that there's something that we can do within that particular sector of the business needs to be communicated more. I would agree with what you're saying, Kerry. There's a bit of reinvention of the wheel going on in different areas of businesses, and we need to coordinate that and make sure it's a consistent message across the whole organisation.
Okay, thank you. Could I get your opinion on it, Marcia?
Yes, well, one of the things that we have done in the past and need to revisit and do again on our new-ish global internet is creating more of a one-stop shop for our customer-facing colleagues who get these questionnaires. There'll always be some question that, they need to come to the corporate responsibility team to have them help with an answer. But a lot of it, we can just make it easier for them to get that information. And that has a benefit because we're in the soul winning business. So the more that our colleagues are being asked these questions and they become familiar with the answers, it allows them to have more conversations with their customers to explain about what they do and how we have shared values. But we're going to try and make it a little bit easier for those who are completing RFPs, RFIs, contract renewals, I wouldn't say this year is any more that there's any more of them necessarily, maybe a little bit more, but you know, I wouldn't expect it to diminish, that's for sure.
Okay, thank you. Right, so looking at some of the questions we've got in the box, so can you give some examples of zero tolerance issues that you found when doing audits? Now, Matthew, I know that you've answered it, but I wondered if you could extrapolate on that a little bit further. So what for you is zero tolerance?
Anything that is a, you know, human rights or a labor issue that instinctually feels to us like we shouldn't, it needs to be remediated immediately. It could be something like, it doesn't have to be that they're doing something egregious. It could be that they just don't have something that we think is absolutely essential, like a policy on child labor. So it's not that they are engaging in child labor, they may just not have a policy, but for us, if it's not communicated to their workforce and the workforce isn't aware of something that is such an important issue, even if it's probably not as likely for us in our supply chain to be an issue, but we can't rule it out. And that would be, you know, it doesn't have to be that they're doing something which is bad per se. It could be just that they haven't thought through an issue that we think is absolutely critical, and so we can help them with that.
Okay, so Anne, from your perspective, has anything come across your table which has caused for a contract to be reviewed because it's not meeting ESG sort of related criteria?
I haven't yet seen that. I think it's still relatively early days in the, you know, for these types of obligations to find it through to the contractual stage. And obviously the modern slavery and anti-bribery is the, you know, that's all well known and understood. I suppose the challenge is I think when acting for suppliers and facing the plethora of compliance documentation, and I think the idea that Marcia has to have the standard answers available would be really helpful, because I think that just causes a bit of an impasse in the negotiation stage when the sales team, the customer facing team are faced with customer requirements and don't quite know how to answer them, and that can give rise to a lot of misunderstanding, and it can damage the relationship between the parties. So I think that in practice is a bit of a painful area. So I think the more we need to do an awful lot more to educate people generally.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I would agree with that. We've literally not so long ago been in a conversation to do with UPS, uninterruptible power supplies for data centers, as part of a strategic sourcing for a client. And just to throw a bit of a spanner in the works, some of the suppliers came in with battery technology versus diesel technology because they said it's cleaner. So we said, okay, where does the lithium and cobalt come from for your batteries? You know, is it from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has some very serious ethical and environmental concerns? The lithium, is it coming from South America? Also the triangle of Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile. Again, some serious concerns about not just pollution of the environment due to the evaporation pools they're using, but the amount of water they're using. And it just stopped the suppliers in their tracks. They had absolutely no idea beyond that. So it's not just about what can IT do, but it's how can IT start leading the questions and leading the thought process in that area.
So it's the Dodd-Frank Act that looks after that, isn't it? So are you just saying people are not really aware of a lot of the mandates that exist?
It's difficult because 85% of the cobalt in batteries last year came from Chinese refineries. So there's a bit of a market dominance going on. So, yes, there are acts to deal with it, but how are people complying with it? How are people ensuring that they're getting clean? As Marcia said earlier, how to ensure you're getting clean raw materials for your products. And things like blockchain could come in there. It's an area where technology can help. But it needs to be, again, blockchain has its own energy issues, If you look at Bitcoin now, we're using more energy than I think Argentina at the moment, but I think it's growing. So, you know, it's supposedly a greener technology, but it's not if you don't use it in the right way. So we have to ask the questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about green technology, Salesforce, obviously a company born in the cloud, obviously doing incredibly well there. How green are the main cloud providers out there at the moment? So anybody able to answer that one? I'm assuming that's a question for Graham, but Marcia may well already know as well.
Sorry, so I have to say I was reading one of the notes coming inside. Can you repeat the question again, please?
Yeah, no, so looking at the cloud providers, so how green are they? Which are the greener ones?
It varies. The Microsoft, for example, have just said that they've got a commitment now to 100% renewable energy by 2025, water positive by 2030, zero waste by 2030, and net zero deforestation. Now you say, okay, what's a cloud provider got to do with deforestation? But they're building big data centers because, you know, again, people are transferring their environmental impact to the cloud providers. So yes, there's a benefit of 30 to 60% energy consumption by moving to cloud infrastructure because it's shared, it's more efficient, but you have to understand where that's going. As I mentioned earlier, Google and Azure and AWS are bringing out tools now where you can examine the environmental impact of your cloud. But if you're using a more local cloud provider, yes, it is a question to ask. There's a lot of shared infrastructure out there. If you look at somebody in the UK, I think is quite high up in the cloud is Rackspace. They actually spread a lot of their cloud across the major providers, so they benefit from what they're doing. But look at where the cloud is coming from and look how you can actually manage it. And make sure, as you say, like with Salesforce, they have a net zero energy policy of saying, okay, everything needs to be renewable. And if it's not renewable, can we get rid of it? And if we can't get rid of it, can we offset it?
And I think that's a really important point, Graham, is about something we haven't discussed, which is about offsetting. So the thing that we absolutely must do to be credible and to make a positive impact on the environment is to reduce our consumption. That's got to be first and foremost. Then we try and buy renewable energy where we can. There are places where it's still not possible to get green tariff. So in those cases, we buy renewable energy certificates, but then there's a tail, and that tail will have to be offset. And there's work to be done, I think, by the purchaser of the offsets to make sure that they are from a recognized they have some type of accreditation, whether that if it's a forestation project like Red Plus or something similar, that you really dig in and understand about the project that you're investing in. So a good example for us, we offset last year with a company, or sorry, with a project that's in Papua New Guinea. And I had no idea until we actually had a conversation with the project that life expectancy for a male is under 50 years old in Papua New Guinea. So we wanted to find out, how much of the offset funding is going to the community, how is it being used? These are kinds of conversations that we can have about the projects that we choose to invest in. We are going to have to offset so that we can reassure ourselves that there is an additionality principle, that this the benefit would not have happened except for the offsets, and those offsets are not being sold to anybody else.
Yeah, I think there's a whole debate there as well, isn't it? Is the offsetting and the difference between carbon neutral and net zero, and a whole debate on offsetting and responsibilities around that. But we are getting quite close to time, so let's just take Sunita's last question, and that is looking at all of the onus on making sure that you are monitoring the ESG within your supply chain. Have you got any advice on, I guess, the governance there and accountability and what to put in place to ensure that you're doing that correctly? Hopefully that's a right sort of rework of your question, Sunita.
It's a good question. From a contractual perspective, I see lots of obligations or customers seeking the right of audit, and I really like the idea of the remote audit, not just because of the pandemic, but I think going forward, because I think there's it's getting the balance right for the supplier and the customer, and I think it's an important area, and it's something that I struggle with when I'm advising clients to know what is the right solution or who to recommend or how that should be done. So I think there is still quite a lot of work to be done in that area.
I would just say that it's tough, Sunita. I'm sure you feel that, sometimes you have this feeling, doing everything I can to understand my own impact, never mind what's happening in my supply chain. And if there ever was something that was a journey, it's around engaging with those suppliers. We try to be better at this year on year, like things that we're introducing, like our supplier day. I put into the chat function about the ESG questionnaire that we give to suppliers, this direct work that we're doing on scope 3, but we need to, it has to change, I think, from just being carrot and stick, that it's all, yeah, we've got to have the supplier code, we have to have the audits, but we're in this together, and we've got to collaborate and help each other, and in some cases even look for third parties that can help us in that, in some of the areas. Give a shout out for one of my colleagues at Schneider Electric that's trying to do some good work in the scope 3 space.
Okay, so you obviously the Transfer Lane project is doing a lot of fantastic sharing. Marcia, you mentioned some different sort of like collaborative groups that you're a member of, and obviously the industry coming together. We are investigating the idea of developing a service provider sustainability maturity index. So that would be looking across the tier 1, tier 2 service providers and using a common set of due diligence. But because we're a people industry, we were looking at actually bringing some people-related metrics in. So, it's really important looking obviously at the modern slavery and all of those things, inclusion and diversity, their own supplier diversity, their use of responsible automation, and also their use of impact sourcing as being key parts of the social piece of ESG. Do you guys think there is a role for something like that to be done, or is that happening somewhere else? Or what are your views on doing that? Graham, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, okay. From a sourcing perspective, I would say yes. I mean, there's a whole raft of things out there that people can be involved with, but I wouldn't say it's individual. I mean, Marcia has talked about the UN, and there's a lot of things about child slavery, women's rights, fair trade. In the Europe, there's Max Havelaar, which is a BO sort of chain, which is similar to fair trade. There's a lot of different activities. Bring them together under one sort of umbrella would be useful, and give us something to refer to when dealing with suppliers, rather than asking all the questions ourselves. I think that would be a useful tool for us.
Views from you, Anne?
Yes, I think anything that can be done to avoid people having to reinvent or re-find information, but actually to make that information much more easily accessible is bound to be helpful. I think certainly in the contracting and the RFP process. To actually have something a little bit more objective, perhaps will surely make it helpful both for customers and suppliers alike.
Yeah, thank you. So that's directly, Fiona, to your point there as well. That's looking at pooled audits. So effectively, it would be a pooled audit. So, Marcia, final views from you on that subject, please.
Well, I did mention Holy Grails, didn't I? And that's certainly one of them. And for over 10 years, I've heard that discussion. Can we do this? And I'm sure that we can. Like in the example that I gave of the PREPS project for paper suppliers. You know, that's exactly what it's aiming to do, is to get, you know, a sense of performance on some key metrics that we need around paper sustainability. But I would hope to see that, because I think it's, again, it's not commercially sensitive, but when, you know, a rising tide lifts all boats. I like that expression.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Yeah, share the best practices. And it's been so great to see that we are really beginning to share so much best practice here. So thank you very much for sharing your insights, Marcia. Yours, Graham, and yours, Anne, much appreciated. And there's been so much information put in the links. So I'm pretty certain we're going to have a spike on hits on your website at Relics, and also the transfer lane. So thank you all very much for joining, and thank you, Marcia, Anne, and Graham, for sharing your insights. We are running over time, so thank you all for staying with us longer than we were supposed to. So thank you, and yeah, I'm sure we'll all be in touch with each other soon. So have a great